No, what we learned in that event, based on what I was able to gather from TV news, which is not a good source of scientific information. On the other hand, I did observe that they probably need a little more training in their emergency management organization in Hawaii. And it's not that the person who pushed the button is a bad person.
Right.
They just weren't practiced enough in it. That's what I would conclude based on what I saw. Well, I can tell you this. I wouldn't do it now off the top of my head. I'd want to sit down and ponder it and think about it carefully. However, I can tell you this. If the next warning occurred within the next 2 or 3 years, I would mention the one that was a false alarm. And I'd explain to them, this isn't that. Because that's going to come up, it's an obstacle for people, so let's get it out of the way. And I probably wouldn't hit the streets with the wireless emergency alert message unless it were also backed up by multiple warnings over multiple dissemination channels, and the TV news stations interrupted coverage and were talking to the public. So I designed warning delivery a little differently in Hawaii. And, you know, we should have counseled Hawaii to consider doing that anyway, just based on all the public chit-chat about all these nuclear bombs that could be flying back and forth, and Hawaii's history with getting attacked in World War II, so on and so forth. So I think a little more broadly than just the message that went out, the official message. Well, first, I'd educate emergency managers to put everything out of their mind, and all the myths that they may have succumbed to, like the public panics if you issue a warning, or emergency responders will turn yellow belly and not show up for work. These things aren't true. The cry wolf syndrome is also a myth. Now, if you issued multiple false alarms for the same population, let's say Hawaii, every other week for a month and a half, then you'd have a false alarm problem. But just because somebody went through one event, they're probably going to be more vigilant and probably more likely to respond well to a subsequent event, having gone through that false alarm, if the second warning takes that into account. So we can actually take advantage of false alarms. Of course, have we trained the warning providers with that knowledge? No. Should we? Yes. Thanks for the question. Interesting, because in the Oroville Dam, one of the counties issued a mandatory evacuation order, and then the biggest city in the county, which represents about 75% of the population of the county, issued a voluntary evacuation, which was a bit confusing for the people who heard them both. I don't recommend that people distinguish between mandatory or voluntary evacuation. I know law enforcement and emergency managers enjoy those distinctions, but it's really splitting hairs. Are you recommending that the public evacuate or not? And if you're not recommending that they evacuate, don't recommend it. And if you are recommending that they evacuate, recommend it. So I come down on the side of public safety. And that would mean if I were recommending an evacuation, I would make it mandatory. Let me just give you an example. I just saw, quite off the record, but let me share it with you in whatever YouTube channels this is going over, the mud flow inundation map for Santa Barbara. Those emergency managers are facing what I called the Godzilla monster. And it's like a PhD exam in emergency management. And you can see all the mud flow tubes and how all these other non-mudded parts of the community will turn into islands and people won't be able to get out for 7 to 14 days. And so they need to evacuate too. So would I recommend ever issuing a voluntary evacuation there? No. I'd recommend issuing a mandatory evacuation, and I'd hit them with every warning dissemination channel I've got. I'd call me up and say, write the message for us. And it would be nonstop news, and the police cruisers would be going up and down the whole thing. That's how I'd handle it. And then it may be that nothing happens. And then I'd get on the tube and say, wow, were we lucky. I'm so happy we erred on the side of caution, which, by the way, is what Sheriff Coney did in Butte County, who recommended immediate evacuation under the Oroville Dam. He's touted as a local hero. And I was in his office and I said, my goodness, you're the Scully of Butte County. He said, you know, the real Scully just lives over there. He's got a ranch in Butte County. So that's what I would do, but that's the emergency manager's call. And of course, that's why they get paid the big bucks for making those decisions. I have a comprehensive list, again, thanks to DHS and FEMA, of hazards our nation faces. You wouldn't believe what some of them are. I've even gone so far as to write warning messages for pending asteroid impacts. We have a global scientific society where people spend all their time looking for rocks in the sky, and there's a lot of them. Most of the hazards that are issued are for that could be warned for are unfamiliar to most of the people who would get them. And even in communities that are used to, for example, earthquakes or floods, tornadoes, etc. Remember, there's always new people that are moving town for whom that's a brand new, unique event. Now, I think the principles of what constitutes good warning practice are pretty much trans-hazard. Even terrorist hazards, biological hazards, technological hazards, natural hazards. How you communicate with people is pretty much the same. And the impact of experience or familiarity, I know it's a quick place to go to think that makes warning easier. It doesn't. It makes it sometimes more challenging because the receiver is burdened by their last experience, and the one they're facing may be totally different, and you have to deal with that in the warning process. So I guess I'm not concerned about level of familiarity. That doesn't mean I don't support public education about hazards ahead of time. However, I'm not troubled by being able to warn people because of that factor. I'd be totally transparent and honest with the public. That's what they want. They can deal with the fact that we're human beings and we don't know everything. And so one way of handling that is we can't predict how high the wave will be. But the best tsunami experts have counseled us to recommend to you that you act as if it will be a 30-foot high wave. Better safe than sorry. That's how I'd recommend handling it.